good evening or afternoon, depending on what part of the globe you're on and what time zone you are in. I am your host, Skeptically Speaking. We have been pouring through this voluminous tome, Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, and now we're on chapter 3. So if you have missed any of the before chapters 1, chapters 2, you can go to YouTube, Skeptically Looking or Skeptical G, and you will find an entire playlist dedicated to this reading. Okay, sound is good. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I wish I could tell how good it is, but I'm going to have to go with your word. Yeah, no. Okay, chapter 3. Let's begin. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied leadership for the American Revolution, that colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen, joined by slaves and servants, a rebellion so threatening that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown. England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to maintain order among 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. After the uprising was suppressed, its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, dead and his associates hanged, Bacon was described in a Royal Commission report. He was said to be about 4 or 5 and 30 years of age, indifferent, tall but slender, black-haired and of ominous, pensive, melancholy aspect, of a pestilent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism. He seduced the vulgar and most ignorant people to believe 2/3 of each county being of that sort. So their whole heart and hopes were set upon Bacon. Next, he charges the governor as negligent and wicked, treacherous and incapable, laws and taxes as unjust and oppressive, and cries up absolute necessity of redress. Thus Bacon encouraged the tumult, and as the unquiet crowd follow and adhere to him, he listeth them as they come in upon a large paper, writing their name, circular wise, that their ringleaders might not be found out, having cornered them into this circle, giving them brandy to wind up the charm, and enjoined them by an oath to stick fast together to him, and the oath being administered, he went and infected New Kent County ripe for rebellion. Bacon's rebellion began with the conflict over how to deal with the Indians, so we're close by. On the western frontier, constantly threatening, whites who had been ignored when huge land grants around Jamestown were given away had gone west to find land, and there they encountered Indians. Were those frontier Virginians resentful that the politicos and landed aristocrats who controlled the colony's government in Jamestown first pushed them westward into Indian territory and then seemed indecisive in fighting the Indians? That might explain the character of their rebellion, not easily classifiable as either anti-aristocrat or anti-Indian, because it was both. And the governor, William Berkeley, and his Jamestown crowd, were they more conciliatory to the Indians, who wooed certain of them as spies and allies? Now that they had monopolized the land in the east, could use frontier whites as a buffer and needed peace? The desperation of the government in suppressing the rebellion seemed to have a double motive, developing an Indian policy which would divide Indians in order to control them. In New England, at this very time, Massasoit's son, Metacom, was threatening to unite Indian tribes and had done frightening damage to Puritan settlements in King Philip's War, and teaching the poor whites of Virginia that rebellion did not pay by a show of superior force, by calling for troops from England itself, by mass hanging. The one thing that threatened the power of the aristocrats was, in fact, the white people joining the native Indians, because both understood that they were being oppressed. That is ironic. Thank you for sharing the live. Please keep tapping that screen. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Share it to 10 people if you could, please. That would be awesome. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Doeg Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and whites, retrieving the hogs, murdered 2 Indians. The Doegs then sent out a war party to kill a white herdsman, after which a white militia company killed 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with Indians outnumbered turning to guerrilla warfare. The House of Burgesses in Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiers people, who wanted total war but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Isn't that ironic? They wanted troops to be sent in to wipe out the natives, but they didn't want to pay higher taxes to pay for it. That's peak white privilege, don't you think? Times were hard in 1676. There were genuine distress, genuine poverty. All contemporary sources speak of the great mass of people as living in severe economic straits, writes Wilcom Washburn, who, using British colonial records, has done an exhaustive study of Bacon's rebellion. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop needed for export. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote wearily about his situation. How miserable that man in this governess of people, where 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. His phrase, 6 parts of 7, suggests the existence of an upper class not so impoverished. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Bacon himself came from this class, had a good bit of land, and was probably more enthusiastic about killing Indians than about redressing the grievances of the poor. But he seemed a symbol of mass resentment against the Virginia establishment, and was elected in the spring of 1676 to the House of Burgesses. Then, when he insisted on the organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside officials' control, Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go to return for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon's Declaration of the People of July 1676, interesting date, shows a mixture of populist resentment against the rich and frontier hatred of the Indians. It indicted the Berkeley administration for unjust taxes, for putting favorites in high position, for monopolizing the beaver trade, and for not protecting the Western farmers from the Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians, killing 8, taking others prisoner, plundering their possessions. Isn't that ironic? Had they just joined the Native Americans, their lives would have instantly gotten better. If they had just joined a friendly Native American tribe. But see, the problem was they would have been endangered as well as turning their backs on their race. You see how that works? And then they would have been considered enemy combatants along with the natives. That's pretty sad. What a sad existence. There is evidence that the rank and file of both Bacon's rebel army and Berkeley's official army were not as enthusiastic as their leaders. There were mass desertions on both sides. According to Washburn, in the fall, Bacon, aged 29, fell sick and died because of, as a contemporary put it, swarms of vermin that bred in his body. A minister, apparently not a sympathizer, wrote his epitaph. Bacon is dead. I am sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. Oh, wow. No love lost there. Am I echoing? How am I echoing? Let me just double check. Thank you for that. Okay, am I still echoing? Please confirm. Please confirm if I'm still echoing. All right, I'm going to continue. Still echoing. I'm not hearing it on my end. I'm sorry. Is anybody else hearing an echo, or is it just me? Or is it just one person? Go ahead. P, go ahead and close your app and come back in. See if that does. Because I am not hearing anything of the sort. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. What, not sure how to. Okay, I've muted. Let me turn down my mic, see if that does anything. Okay, how about now? Am I still mute? Am I still echoing? Echoing? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue. Thank you for the likes. Oh, that's better. Okay, so my mic was a little too high. I gotcha. Okay. Nope. What? You have to be more descriptive. You can't if you say nope, I won't understand what that even means. You gotta use complete sentences, please. There's no echo. Okay, good. All right. That's good news. So this minister was actually happy that Bacon had died. Whew. The rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruising the York River became the base of securing order, and its captain, Thomas Grantham, used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon the chief garrison of the rebellion, he found 400 armed Englishmen and Negroes, a mixture of freemen, servants, and slaves. He promised to pardon everyone, to give freedom to slaves and the servants, whereupon they surrendered their arms and dispersed, except for 80 Negroes and 20 English who insisted on keeping their arms. Grantham promised to take them to a garrison down the river, but when they got into the boat, he trained his big guns on them, disarmed them, and eventually delivered the slaves and servants to their masters. The remaining garrisons were overcome one by one. 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a complete chain of oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by white frontiersmen who were taxed and controlled by the Jamestown elite. And the whole colony was being exploited by England, which bought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated and made 100,000 pounds a year for the king. Berkeley himself, returning to England years later to protest the English Navigation Acts, which gave English merchants a monopoly of the colonial trade, had said, "We cannot but resent that 40,000 people should be impoverished to enrich little more than 40 merchants, who, being the only buyers of our tobacco, give us what they please for it, and after it is here, sell it how they please, and indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates than any other men having slaves." So literally, uh, the colonists were already being treated as just above a slave by keeping their profits down to a bare minimum. Isn't that some rich irony for you? From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had the overwhelming support of the Virginia population. A member of his council reported that the defection was almost general and laid it to the lewd dispositions of some persons of desperate fortunes, who had vain hopes of taking the country wholly out of his majesty's hands into their own. Another member of the governor's council, Richard Lee, noted that Bacon's rebellion had started over Indian policy, but the zealous inclination of the multitude to support Bacon was due, he said, to hopes of leveling. Leveling meant equalizing the wealth. Leveling was to be behind countless actions of poor whites against the rich in all of the English colonies in the century and a half before the Revolution. The servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserable poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 15 and 1600s, the enclosing of land for the production of wool, filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them. The Elizabethan definition of rogues and vagabonds included all persons calling themselves scholars, going about begging, all seafaring men pretending losses of their ships or goods on the sea, going about the country begging, all idle persons going about in any country either begging or using any subtle craft or unlawful games, common players of interludes and minstrels wandering abroad, all wandering persons and common laborers, being persons able in body, using loitering and refusing to work for such reasonable wages as is taxed or commonly given. Imagine that. Imagine that. You are being told you are a criminal by not having work, by traveling from town to town hoping to get work, or you're an unemployed seaman. Anybody could be considered a vagrant and a vagabond. It created an entire criminal caste just for being poor. This would be considered the war on the poor. Instead of a war on poverty, this was a war waged on the poor people. Isn't that ironic? Such persons found begging could be stripped to the waist and whipped bloody, could be sent out of the city, sent to workhouses, or transported out of the country. No rights. In the 16 and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, and lies, by kidnapping, by the urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, traders, ship captains, and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, Colonists in Bondage, he writes, from the complex pattern of forces producing immigration to the American colonies who stand out clearly as the most powerful in causing the movements of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them. After signing the indenture, in which the immigrants agreed to pay their cost of passage by working for a master for 5 or 7 years, they were often imprisoned until the ship sailed to make sure they did not run away. In the year 1619, the Virginian House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America, it was also the year of the first importation of black slaves. Remember the 1619 Project. Provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts between servants and masters. As in any contract between unequal powers, the parties appeared on paper as equals, but enforcement was far easier for masters than for servants. The voyage to America lasted 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and the servants were packed into ships with the most fanatic concern for profits that marked the slave ships. If the weather was bad and the ship took too long, they ran out of food. The sloop Seaflower, leaving Belfast in 1741, was at sea 16 weeks, and when it arrived in Boston, 46 of its 106 passengers were dead of starvation, 6 of them eaten by the survivors. This is how little the super and uber rich care about those who are of the poor class. If you think they won't do it again, they're already doing it. They would have you reduced to such poverty that you would be desperate for crumbs, desperate for just a smidgen. On another trip, 32 children died of hunger and disease and were thrown into the ocean. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a musician traveling from Germany to America in 1750, wrote about his voyage. During the journey, the ship is full of pitiful signs of distress, smells, fumes, horrors, vomiting, various kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and similar afflictions, all of them caused by the age and the high salted state of the food, especially of the meat, as well as by the very bad and filthy water. Add to all that shortage of food, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, as well as other troubles. On board our ship, on a day on which we had a great storm, a woman about to give birth and unable to deliver under the circumstances was pushed through one of the portholes into the sea. We don't even know if that woman was alive or dead. Pushed out of a porthole into the sea. Can you imagine surviving a voyage of that nature? Can you imagine surviving? What do you think would do? What do you think it would do to your mental state? I wouldn't, I don't know if I'd want to even survive something like that. Indentured servants were bought and sold like slaves. An announcement in the Virginia Gazette, March 28, 1771, read, "Just arrived in Leadstone, the ship Justitia, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sale will commence on Tuesday, the 2nd of April. Healthy as compared to what, I wonder? Against the rosy accounts of better living standards in the Americas, one must place many others, like one immigrant's letter from America. Whoever is well off in Europe better remain there. Here is misery and distress, same as everywhere, and for certain persons and conditions incomparably more than in Europe. Beatings and whippings were common. Servant women were raped. One observer testified, "I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head till the blood has followed, but a fault that is not worth the speaking of." A Maryland court record showed many servant suicides. In 1671, Governor Berkeley of Virginia reported that in previous years, 4 or 5 servants died of disease after their arrival. Many were poor children, gathered up by the hundreds on the streets of English cities and sent to Virginia to work. Surviving the horrors of England and Europe, only to have to survive even more horrors here on the continent. The master tried to control completely the sexual lives of the servants. It was in his economic interest to keep women servants from marrying or from having sexual relations because childbearing could interrupt or interfere with their work. Benjamin Franklin, writing as Poor Richard in 1736, gave advice to his readers: "Let thy maidservant be faithful, strong, and homely." Thank you, Benjamin. Servants could not marry without permission, could be separated from their families, could be whipped for various offenses. Pennsylvania law in the 17th century had that marriage of servants without the consent of the masters shall proceeded against as for adultery and fornication, and children to be reputed as bastards. Although colonial laws existed to stop excesses against servants, they were not well enforced. We learn from Richard Morris's comprehensive study of early court records in government and labor in early America. Servants did not participate in juries, masters did. And being propertyless, servants did not vote. In 1666, a New England court accused a couple of the death of a servant after the mistress had cut off the servant's toes. The jury voted acquittal. In Virginia in the 1660s, a master was convicted of raping 2 women servants. He also was known to beat his own wife and children. He had whipped and chained another servant until he died. The master was berated by the court, but specifically cleared of the rape charge despite overwhelming evidence. We love the TikTok shop. This is, we do not condone this behavior. We are reading this for educational purposes only. We do not condone this behavior. This is only for educational purposes only. Sometimes servants organized rebellions, but one did not find on the mainland the kind of large-scale conspiracies of servants that existed. For instance, on Barbados and the West Indies. Abbott Smith suggested this was because there was more chance of success on a small island. Please keep tapping that screen. I'd appreciate that. And I wouldn't say no to a few gifts. That'll keep us boosted in the algorithm. However, and please become a skeptic. Thank you for joining. I appreciate that. Good to see you, Mr. Potato Chip. Please join the skeptic community by hitting the orange heart just above. However, in York County, Virginia, in 1661, a servant named Isaac Freed proposed to another, after much dissatisfaction with the food, and that they get a matter of 40 of them together and get guns, and he would be the first and lead them and cry as they went along, "Who would be for liberty and free from bondage?" Imagine, imagine that the fight for liberty started with the slave class. That is amazing. And then the movement got co-opted uh, by the colonist property owners against England. The scheme was never carried out, but 2 years later in Gloucester County, servants again planned a general uprising. One of them gave the plot away and 4 were executed. The informer was given his freedom and £5,000 of tobacco. Despite the rarity of servants' rebellions, the threat was always there, and the masters were fearful. Finding their situation intolerable, the rebellion impractical in an increasingly organized society, servants reacted in individual ways. The files of the county courts in New England show that one servant struck at his master with a pitchfork. An apprentice servant was accused of laying violent hands upon his master and throwing him down twice and fetching blood of him. Not sure what that means. Threatening to break his neck, running at his face with a chair. One maid servant was brought into court for being bad, unruly, sullen, careless, destructive, and disobedient. After the participation of servants in Bacon's rebellion, the Virginia legislature passed laws to punish servants who rebelled. The preamble to the act said, whereas many evil-disposed servants in their late times of horrid rebellion, taking advantage of the looseness and liberty of the time, did depart from their service, and followed the rebels in rebellion, wholly neglecting their masters' employment, whereby the said masters have suffered great damage and injury. 2 companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against the future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lord of Trade and Plantation, saying, Virginia is at a present poor and more populous than ever. There is great apprehension of a rising among the servants, owing to the great necessities and want for clothes. They may plunder the storehouses and ships. Escape was easier than rebellion. Numerous instances of mass desertions by white servants took place in the southern colonies, reports Richard Morris, on the basis of an inspection of colonial newspapers in the 1700s. The atmosphere of 17th century Virginia, he says, was charged with plots and rumors of combinations of servants to run away. The Maryland courts records show in the 1650s a conspiracy of a dozen servants to seize a boat and to resist with arms if intercepted. They were captured and whipped. All right. Well, thank you for, yes, Free Palestine indeed. Thank you for listening to us. I hope I can keep you active and keep you focused on the road. Thank you so much. It's going to be a great day. I hope so. The mechanism of control was formidable. Strangers had to show passports or certificates to prove they were free men. Agreements among the colonies provided for the extradition of fugitive servants. These became the basis of the clause of the U.S. Constitution that persons held to service or labor in one state escaping into another shall be delivered up. Sometimes servants went on strike. One Maryland master complained to the provincial court in 1663 that his servants did peremptorily and positively refuse to go and do their ordinary labor. The servants responded that they were fed only beans and bread, and they were so weak we are not able to perform the employments he puts on us upon. They were given 30 lashes by the court. More than half the colonists who came to the North American shores, if the colonial period came as servants, they were mostly English in the 17th century, Irish and German in the 18th century. More and more slaves replaced them as they ran away to freedom to finish their time. But as late as 1755, white servants made up 10% of the population of Maryland. What happened to these servants after they became free? They are cheerful accounts in which they rise to prosperity, becoming landowners and important figures. But Abbott Smith, after a careful study, concludes that colonial society was not democratic and certainly not equalitarian. It was dominated by men who had money enough to make others work for them. And few of these men were descended from indentured servants, and practically none of them had themselves been of that class. After we make our way through Abbott Smith's disdain for the servants as men and women who were dirty and lazy, rough, ignorant, lewd, and often criminal, who thieved and wandered, had bastard children, and corrupted society with loathsome diseases. We find that about 1 in 10 was a sound and solid individual who would, if fortunate surviving his seasoning, work out his time, take up land, and wax decently prosperous. Perhaps another 1 in 10 would become an artisan or an overseer. The rest, 80%, who were certainly shiftless, homeless, ruined individuals, either died during their servitude, returned to England after it was over, or became poor whites. Smith's conclusion is supported by a more recent study of servants in the 17th century Maryland, where it was found that the first batches of servants became landowners and politically active in the colony. But by the second half of the century, more than half the servants, even after 10 years of freedom, remained landless. Servants became tenants, providing cheap labor for the large planters both during and after their servitude. It seems quite clear that class lines hardened through the colonial period. The distinction between rich and poor became sharper. By 1700, there were 50 rich families in Virginia. Sound familiar? I wonder who would be considered rich families today. The Waltons, Elon Musk, who else? I'm talking about the top 1%. By 1700, there were 50 rich families in Virginia with wealth equivalent to 50,000 pounds, a huge sum in those days, who lived off the labor of black slaves and white servants, owned the plantations, sat on the governor's council, served as local magistrates. In Maryland, the settlers were ruled by a proprietor whose right of total control over the colony had been granted by the English king. Between 1650 and 1689, there were 5 revolts against that proprietor. In the Carolinas, the fundamental constitution was written in the 1660s by John Locke, who is often considered the philosophical father of the founding fathers and the American system. Locke's constitution set up a feudal-type aristocracy, in which 8 barons could own 40% of the colony's land, and only a baron could be governor. When the Crown took direct control of North Carolina after a rebellion against the land arrangements, rich speculators seized 500,000 acres for themselves, monopolizing the good farming land near the coast. Poor people, desperate for land, squatted on bits of farmland and fought all through the pre-revolutionary period against the landowners' attempts to collect rent. Carl Breidenbau's study of colonial cities, cities in the wilderness, reveals a clear-cut class system. He finds the leaders of early Boston were gentlemen of considerable wealth who, in association with the clergy, eagerly sought to preserve in America the social arrangements of the mother country. Tim Tam, good to see you. No, we'll leave him be. Just keep an eye on him if you could, please. Let's see. By means of their control of trade and commerce, by their political domination of the inhabitants through church and town meeting, and by careful marriage alliances among themselves, members of this little oligarchy laid the foundations of the aristocratic class in the 17th century Boston. At the very start of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, the governor, John Winthrop, had declared the philosophy of the rulers. In all times, some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Rich merchants erected mansions, persons of quality traveled in coaches and sedan chairs. They had their portraits painted, wore periwigs, and filled themselves with rich food and Madeira. A petition came from the town of Deerfield in 1678 to the Massachusetts General Court. You may be pleased to know that the very principle and the best of the land, the best for soil, the best for situation, as laying in your center and middle of the town, and as to quantity near half, belong unto 8 or 9 proprietors. No, not Tim Pool. Somebody named Tim Tam. uh, I don't know. This person's just trolling us, I guess. Tim Tam does seem familiar, though. I'm a girl, by the way, Tim Tam. Can't you tell? In Newport, Rhode Island, Breidenbau found, and in Boston, that the town meetings, while ostensibly democratic, were in reality controlled year after year by the same group of merchants, aristocrats, who secured most of the important offices. And a contemporary described the Newport merchants as men in flaming scarlet coats and waistcoats laced and fringed with the brightest glaring yellow. The sly Quakers, not venturing on these charming coats and waistcoats, yet loving finery, figured away with plate on their sideboards. So even the Quakers were making bank, as you could say. Just say you're a pachyderm, Sweet Pea. You identify as elephant. Elephants are awesome. 10 out of 10 hair. Oh, well, thank you kindly. At least the troll appreciates my hair. I appreciate that. The New York aristocracy was the most ostentatious of all. Breidenbau tells of window hangings of camlet, japanned tables, gold-framed looking glasses, spinets, and massive 8-day clocks, richly carved furniture and jewels and silver plate, black house servants. New York in the colonial period was like a feudal kingdom. The Dutch had set up a patroonship system along the Hudson River with enormous landed estates where the barons controlled completely the lives of their tenants. And in 1689, many of the grievances of the poor were mixed up in the farmers' revolt of Jacob Leisler and his group. Leisler was hanged, and the parceling out of huge estates continued. Under Governor Benjamin Fletcher, 3/4 of the land in New York was granted to about 30 people. He gave a friend 500,000 acres for a token annual payment of 30 shillings. Under Lord Cornbury in the early 1700s, one grant to a group of speculators was for 2 million acres. Identify as a rainbow cookie. Very good. In 1700, New York City church wardens had asked for funds from the Common Council because the cries of the poor and the impotent for want of relief and were extremely grievous. In the 1730s, demand began to grow for institutions to contain the many beggarly people daily suffered to wander about the streets. A city council resolution read, "Whereas the necessity, number, and continual increase of the poor within the city is very great, and frequently commit diverse misdemeanors within the said city, who living idly and unemployed become debauched, and instructed in the practice of thievery and debauchery, for remedy whereof resolved that there be forthwith built a good, strong, and convenient house and tenement." So basically, another poorhouse. That's it. So these greedy land barons and landowners they could not bear to lift people out of poverty by opening the doors and allowing more people into the system. They decided to protect their own interests by shutting out the poor and keeping them poor. Because when you keep people desperate, they will accept any meager job, no matter how ridiculously ill-paying it is. Please keep tapping that screen. We're at 11,000 likes. Please keep tapping that screen. I appreciate you. And I will not say no to a few gifts. I would appreciate that too. That those TikTok coins boost the live. And please share it with 10 people if you could. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Thomas and Mr. Potato and Sweet Pea. Sweet Pea, you're at level 3 already. Goodness. You've been busy. A letter to Pete Zinger's New York Journal in 1737 described the poor street urchins of New York as an object in human shape, half starved with cold, with clothes out of the elbows, knees through the breeches, hair standing on end. From the age about 4 to 14, they spend their days in the streets. Then they put out then they are put out as apprentices, perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 years. The colonies grew fast in the 1700s. English settlers were joined by Scottish, Irish, and German immigrants. Black slaves were pouring in. They were 8% of the population in 1690, 21% in 1770. The population of the colonies was 250,000 in 1700. 1.6 million by 1760. Agriculture was growing. Small manufacturing was developing. Shipping and trading were expanding. The big cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, were doubling and tripling in size. Throughout all that growth, the upper class was getting most of the benefits and monopolized political power. A historian who studied Boston tax lists in 1687 and 1771 found that in 1687 there were, out of a population of 6,000, about 1,000 property owners, and that of the top 5%. 1% of the population consisted of 50 rich individuals who had 25% of the wealth. By 1770, the top 1% of property owners owned 44% of the wealth. You see how that works? Oh, you're level 25. Oh, I meant it says skeptic 3, level 3. It just has the Roman numerals 3. I'm not sure what that's about. Nearly at 26. Well done. As Boston grew from 1687 to 1770, the percentage of adult males who were poor, perhaps rented a room or slept in the back of a tavern, owned no property, doubled from 14% of the adult males to 29%. And the loss of property meant loss of voting rights. You have to have property in order to vote. That was early America for you. Everywhere the poor were struggling to stay alive, simply to keep from freezing in cold weather. All the cities built poorhouses in the 1730s, not just for old people, widows, crippled, and orphans, but for unemployed war veterans. I see nothing has changed, really, has it? Not much, anyway. New immigrants, and in New York at mid-century, the city almshouse, built for 100 poor, were housing over 400. A Philadelphia citizen wrote in 1748, "It is remarkable what an increase of the number of beggars there is about this town this winter." In 1757, Boston officials spoke of a great number of poor who can scarcely procure from day to day daily bread for themselves and families. Kenneth Lockridge, in a study of colonial New England, found that vagabonds and paupers kept increasing, and wandering poor were a distinct fact of New England life in the middle of the 1700s. James T. Lemon and Gary Nash found a similar concentration of wealth, a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, in their study of Chester County, Pennsylvania, in the 1700s. The colonies, it seems, were societies of contending classes, a fact obscured by the emphasis and traditional histories on the external struggle against England, the unity of the colonists in the Revolution. The country, therefore, was not born free, but born slave and free, servant, master, tenant, landlord, poor, and rich. As a result, the political authorities were opposed frequently, vociferously, and sometimes violently, according to Nash. Outbreaks of disorder punctuated the last quarter of the 17th century, toppling established governments in Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Free white workers were better off than slaves or servants, but they still resented unfair treatment by the wealthier classes. As early as 1636, an employer off the coast of Maine reported that his workmen and fishermen fell into mutiny because he had withheld their wages. They deserted en masse. 5 years later, carpenters in Maine protested against inadequate food, engaged in a slowdown. At the Gloucester shipyards in the 1640s, what Richard Morris calls the first lockout in American labor history took place when the authorities told a group of troublesome shipwrights that they could not work a stroke of work more. There were early strikes of coopers, butchers, bakers protesting against government control of the fees they charged. Porters in the 1650s in New York refused to carry salt, and carters, truckers, teamsters, carriers who went out on strike were prosecuted in New York City for not obeying the command and doing their duties as becomes them in their places. Wow. In 1741, bakers combined to refuse to bake because they had to pay such high prices for wheat. A severe food shortage in Boston in 1713 brought a warning from town selectmen of the General Assembly of Massachusetts saying the threatening scarcity of provisions had led to such extravagant prices that the necessities of the poor in the approaching winter must needs be very pressing. Andrew Belcher, a wealthy merchant who exporting grain from the Caribbean because of the profit was greater there. On May 19th, 200 people rioted on the Boston Common. They attacked Belcher's ships, broke into his warehouses looking for corn, and shot the lieutenant governor when he tried to interfere. 8 years after the bread riot on the Common, a pamphleteer protesting against those who became rich by grinding the poor by studying how to oppress, cheat, and overreach their neighbors, he denounced the rich, great, and potent, who with rapacious violence bear down all before them. Imagine that. Labor unions, the birth of labor unions and organization. I tell you, we are not only repeating history. It's like this when they say make America great again. When the billionaires use that phrase, this is what they're talking about: keeping the poor poor and the rich richer, and even doubling and tripling their wealth. Okay, I'm watching. What am I watching for? Watch the screen. Give it a few seconds. And it's a heart stick, a heart on a stick. Well, thank you. I appreciate the gifts. Thank you very much. We're at 13,000 likes. Keep tapping that screen, guys. Excellent work. One and all. In the 1730s, in Boston, people protesting the high prices established by merchants demolished the public market in Dock Square, while as a conservative writer complained, murmuring against the government and the rich people. No one was arrested after the demonstrators warned that arrests would bring 500 men in solemn league and covenant, who would destroy other markets set up for the benefit of the rich merchants. They even had their own stores. They had their own stores where only the rich could buy from them. Isn't that amazing? And that's where they sold only the best. They kept the best. Sinclair Lewis, I think his name is, or Upton Sinclair, in his book, The Jungle, he writes how meat markets, people or butchers would reserve the best cuts of meat for those who paid higher prices, who could afford to. Contaminated milk was sold to the poor, and it was okay. They didn't care. By the way, this book that we are reading is for educational purposes only. We do not condone the actions contained therein. We love the TikTok shop. Thank you very much. Around the same time in New York, an election pamphlet urged New York voters to join Shuttle the Weaver, Plane the Joiner, Drive the Carter, Mortar the Mason, Tar the Mariner, Snip the Tailor, Small Rent the fair-minded landlord, and John Poor the tenant, against Gripe the merchant, Squeeze the shopkeeper, Spintex the quibble the lawyer. The electorate was urged to vote out of office people of exalted stations who scorned those they call the vulgar, the mob, the herd of mechanics. Amazing. So now the rich are starting to sweat at this point because now their power is being threatened. Oh, you mean they're going to stop voting for us? They can't do that to us. We're rich. We're the rich people. In the 1730s, a committee of the Boston town meeting spoke out for Bostonians in debt who wanted paper money issued to make it easier to pay off their debts to the merchant elite. They did not want, they declared, to have our bread and water measured out to us by those who riot in luxury and wantonness on our sweat and toil. Very well said. Bostonians rioted also against the impressment, in which men were drafted for naval service. This happened on the continent. Amazing. They surrounded the house of the governor, beat up the sheriff, locked up a deputy sheriff, and stormed the townhouse where the general court sat. The militia did not respond when called to put them down, and the governor fled. The crowd was condemned by the merchants group as a riotous, tumultuous assembly of foreign seamen, servants, negroes, and other persons of mean and vile condition. The slime and the smear campaigns. This is what Republicans do. Whenever the common folk rise up against the mistreatment, against the poor wages, against the rich getting richer, this is how they do it. They try to denigrate people who come to this country seeking asylum, people who are trying to find a better life for themselves. They're called criminals. They're called crazy people let out of asylums. This is what Donald Trump does. This is what MAGA does. They smear the very people trying to find a better life, trying to eke out an existence for their families. This is how they do it. In New Jersey in the 1740s and 1750s, poor farmers occupying land over which that the landowners had rival claims rioted when rents were demanded of them. In 1745, Samuel Baldwin, who had long lived on his land, who had held an Indian title to it, was arrested for non-payment of rent to the proprietor and taken to the Newark jail. A contemporary described what happened then. The people in general, supposing the design of the proprietors were to ruin them, went to the prison, opened the door, and took out Baldwin. When two men were freed, when the two men who freed Baldwin were arrested, hundreds of New Jersey citizens gathered around the jail. A report sent by the New Jersey government to the Lords of Trade in London described the scene. Two of the new captains of the Newark companies, by the sheriff's order, went with their drums to the people so met, and required all persons there belonging to their companies to follow the drum and to defend the prison, but none followed. Though many were there, the multitude between 4 and 5 of the clock in the afternoon lighted off their horses and came towards the gale, hustling and huzzaing and swinging their clubs, till they came within reach of the guard, struck them with their clubs, and the guard, having no orders to fire, returned the blows with their guns, and some were wounded on both sides, but none killed. The multitude broke the ranks of the soldiers and pressed on the prison door, where the sheriff stood with the sword, and kept them off, till they gave him several blows, and forced him out from thence. They then, with axes and other instruments, broke open the prison door, and took out the two prisoners, as also one of other prisoner that were confined for debt, and went away. That's, I think of ICE. You know, when they try to bully people, when they try to kidnap people off the street. Imagine if we did what the early colonists did. What if we spoke truth to power and stood up? Oh, I wonder. Through this period, England was fighting a series of wars. Queen Anne's Wars in the early 1700s, King George's Wars in the 1730s. Some merchants made fortunes from these wars, but for most people, they meant higher taxes, unemployment, poverty. An anonymous pamphlet in the Massachusetts, writing angrily after King George's War, described the situation. Poverty and discontent appear in every face except the countenance of the rich, and dwell upon every tongue. He spoke of a few men, fed by lust of power, lust of fame, lust of money, who got rich during the war. No wonder such men can build ships, houses, buy farms, set up their coaches, chariots, live very splendidly, purchase fame, posts of honor. He called them birds of prey, enemies to all communities wherever they lived. Wouldn't it be awesome? Thank you for the follow. I appreciate that. Wouldn't it be awesome if we started viewing or calling out the super rich and calling them to their faces as enemies to all communities wherever they live? What if we actually saw the super rich as enemies of the people? Those that hoard their wealth, those that use their wealth to keep people out, to keep people subjected, like the ruling 1% class is doing today. I wonder what we could accomplish if we started viewing them as predators and as leeches on the system. Remember, the biggest welfare queen you will ever meet or ever read about is the billionaire class. They get all the subsidies, they get all the tax breaks, they get all the consideration, and they get to hoard their wealth literally tax-free. They get write-off after write-off after write-off. This is what the billionaire class does. The forced service of seamen led to a riot against impressment in Boston in 1747. The crowds turned against Thomas Hutchinson, a rich merchant and colonial official who had backed the governor in putting down the riot, who had also designed a currency plan for Massachusetts, which seemed to discriminate against the poor. Hutchinson's house burned down mysteriously, and a crowd gathered in the street cursing Hutchinson and shouting, "Let it burn." By the years of the Revolutionary Crisis, the 1760s, the wealthy elite that controlled the British colonies on the American mainland had 150 years of experience, had learned certain things about how to rule. They had various fears, but also had various tactics to deal with what they feared. The Indians, they had found, were too unruly to keep as a labor force. That and remained an obstacle to expansion. Black slaves were easier to control, and their profitability for southern plantations was bringing an enormous increase in the importation of slaves, who were becoming a majority in some colonies and constituted 1/5 of the entire colonial population. But the blacks were not totally submissive, and as their numbers grew, the prospect of slave rebellions also grew. With the problem of Indian hostility and the danger of slave revolts, the colonial elite had to consider the class anger of poor whites, servants, tenants, and poor people, and proselytes, the taxpayer, the soldier, the sailor. As the colonies passed their 100th year and went into the middle of the 1700s, as the gap between the poor and the rich widened, as violence and the threat of violence increased, the problem of control became more serious. What if these different despised groups, the Indians, the slaves, the poor whites, should combine? Oh, they don't like that unity. They don't like that one bit. Thank you so much for the chili peppers. Oh, thank you so much. I got a crab on my head. Thank you for that. First time seeing that. Yes, throw some chili peppers my way. Throw them at me. I could use some spice in my life. Even before there were so many blacks in the 17th century, there was, as Abbott Smith puts it, a lively fear that servants would join with the Negroes and Indians to overcome the small number of the masters. They do not like solidarity. They cannot stand solidarity, and they do not like union. They do not like unity. This is why the federal government went after civil rights leaders so hard during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even 70s. There was little chance that whites and Indians would combine in North America, as they were doing in South and Central America, where the shortage of women and the use of Indians on the plantation led to daily contact. Only in Georgia and South Carolina, where white women were scarce, was there some sexual mixing of white men and Indian women. In general, the Indian had been pushed out of sight, out of touch. One fact disturbed: whites would run off to join Indian tribes or would be captured in battle and brought up among the Indians. And when this happened, the whites, given a chance to leave, chose to stay in the Indian culture. Can't have that now, can we? Indians, having the choice, almost never decided to join the whites. Amazing. Hector St. Jean Crevecoeur, the Frenchman who lived in America for almost 20 years, told in letters from an American farmer how children captured during the 7 Years' War, found by their parents, grown up and living with Indians, would refuse to leave their new families. I wonder why. There must be in their social bond, he said, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us, for thousands of Europeans are Indians. And we have no examples of even one of these aborigines having from choice become Europeans. But this affected a few people. In general, the Indian was kept at a distance, and the colonial officialdom had found a way of alleviating the danger. By monopolizing the good land on the eastern seaboard, they forced landless whites to move westward to the frontier, there to encounter the Indians and to be a buffer for the seaboard rich against Indian troubles. Those sons of bitches, they used poor whites as a human shield from Indian attacks. Bacon's rebellion was instructive. To conciliate a diminished Indian population at the expense of infuriating a coalition of white frontiersmen was very risky. Better to make war on the Indian, gain the support of the white, divert possible class conflict by turning poor whites against Indians for the security of the elite. Thank you so much. I have achieved all the peppers. Thank you so much. I'm 50% part of the way. So, yep, TikTok would like me to stop and celebrate that. Okay. White, might blacks and Indians combine against the white enemy? In the northern colonies, except on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Rhode Island, there where there was close contact and sexual mixing. There was not much opportunity for Africans and Indians to meet in large numbers. New York had the largest slave population in the North, and there was some contact between blacks and Indians. And in 1712, when the Africans and Indians joined in an insurrection, but this was quickly suppressed. In the North Carolinas, however, whites were outnumbered by black slaves and in nearby Indian tribes, and in the 1750s, 250,000 whites faced 40,000 black slaves and 60,000 Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Indians in the area. Gary Nash writes, Indian uprisings that punctuated the colonial period and the secession of slave uprisings and insurrectionary plots that were nipped in the bud kept South Carolinians sickeningly aware that only through the great vigilance and through policies designed to keep their enemies divided could they hope to remain in the control of the situation. Are you seeing the game being played before your very eyes? Do you see it now? Do you see it? This is why they want us divided. Yes, I'm going to speak loud and proud. Give a shout out. Thank you so much for that. They want us divided and they want us fighting amongst them ourselves. This is why they're turning attention to trans athletes. This is why they're turning our attention to LGBTQ members. This is why they're trying to divert our attentions to immigrants and asylum seekers coming to our southern border. They're trying to keep us divided and hating each other when the real enemy is the top 1% who controls the majority of the wealth. People like Elon Musk and the Walton family, just to name a few. And Wall Street Fortune 500 companies, lump them in as well. The white rulers of the Carolinas seem to be conscious of the need for a policy, as one of them put it, to make Indians and Negroes a check upon each other, lest by their vastly superior numbers we should be crushed by one or the other. And so laws were passed prohibiting free blacks from traveling to Indian country. That's okay. You're fine. You've done above and beyond. Thank you so much, Sweet Pea. And treaties with Indian tribes contain clauses requiring the return of fugitive slaves. Governor Layton of South Carolina wrote in 1738, "It has always been the policy of this government to create an aversion in them to Negroes," basically making Indians hate Negroes. Isn't that amazing? That has always been the goal, and it's still working today. They're trying to get us to hate the black community, and they want the black community to hate the white community, and they're keeping us divided. When are we going to get our heads extracted out of our anal protrusions? When are we going to realize that we have more in common with each other than this ruling class trying to keep us divided? I ask for a friend. Part of this policy involved using black slaves in the South Carolina militia to fight Indians or to be trackers. Still, the government was worried about the Black Revolt, and during the Cherokee War in the 1760s, a motion to equip 500 slaves to fight the Indians lost in the Carolina Assembly by a single vote. You still don't think your vote matters? Things like this are decided by a single vote. Imagine that. Blacks ran away to Indian villages, and the Creeks and Cherokees harbored runaway slaves by the hundreds. Many of these were amalgamated into the Indian tribe, married, produced children. But the combination of harsh slave codes and bribes to the Indians to help put down black rebels kept things under control. It was the potential combination of poor whites and blacks that caused the most fear among the wealthy white planters. If they had been the natural racial repugnance that some theorists have assumed control would have been much easier. But sexual attraction was powerful across racial lines. In 1743, a grand jury in Charleston, South Carolina, denounced the too common practice of criminal conversation with Negro and other slave wenches in this province. Mixed offspring continued to be produced by white-black sex relations throughout the colonial period. In spite of the laws prohibiting interracial marriage in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas and Georgia, by declaring the children illegitimate, they would keep them inside the black families so that the white population would remain pure and in control. By the way, we love the TikTok shop, and we do not condone this racism herein. This book is being read for educational purposes, and we do not condone actions taken. What made Bacon's rebellion especially fearsome for the rulers of Virginia was that the black slaves and white servants joined forces. The final surrender was by 400 English and Negroes in arms at one garrison, and 300 freemen and African and English bondservants in another garrison. The naval commander who subdued the 400 wrote, "Most of them I persuaded to go to their homes, which accordingly they did, except about 80 Negroes and 20 English, which would not deliver their arms." Oh, can't have that. All through those early years, black and white slaves and servants ran away together, as shown both by the laws passed to stop this and the records of the courts. In 1698, South Carolina passed a deficiency law requiring plantation owners to have at least one white servant for every 6 male Negroes. A letter from the southern colonies in 1682 complained of no white men to superintend our Negroes or repress an insurrection of Negroes. In 1691, the House of Commons received a petition of diverse merchants, masters of ships, planters, and others trading to foreign plantations, setting forth that plantations cannot be maintained without considerable number of white servants, as well as to keep the blacks in subjection, as to bear arms in case of invasion. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. That was used specifically to arm white people to keep the black people in line. It was not about your personal liberty or freedom. It was always in context of a militia that was organized by the government presiding. Interesting note. A report to the English government in 1721 said that in South Carolina, black slaves have lately attempted and were very near succeeding in a new revolution, and therefore it may be necessary to propose some new law of encouraging the entertainment of more white servants in the future. The militia of this province does not consist above 2,000 men. Apparently, 2,000 were not considered sufficient to meet the threat. And how right they were. This fear may help explain why Parliament in 1717 made transportation to the New World a legal punishment for crime. After that, tens of thousands of convicts could be sent to Virginia, Maryland, and other colonies. It also makes understandable why the Virginia Assembly, after Bacon's rebellion, gave amnesty to white servants who had rebelled, but not to blacks. You see that? Negroes were forbidden to carry any arms, while whites finishing their servitude could get muskets along with corn and cash. The distinctions of status between white and black servants became more and more clear. In the 1720s, with fear of slave rebellion growing, white servants were allowed in Virginia to join the militia as substitutes for white freedmen. At the same time, slave patrols were established in Virginia to deal with the great dangers that may happen by the insurrections of Negroes. Poor white men would make up the rank and file of these patrols and get a monetary reward. Racism was becoming more and more practical. Edmund Morgan, on the basis of his careful study of slavery in Virginia, sees racism not as natural to black-white difference, but something coming out of class scorn, a realistic device for control. If freedmen with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the result might be worse than anything Bacon had done. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous black slaves by a screen of racial contempt. There was still another control which became handy as the colonies grew, and which had crucial consequences of the continued rule of the elite throughout American history. Along with the very rich and the very poor, there developed a white middle class of small planters, independent farmers, city artisans, who, given small rewards for joining forces with merchants and planters, would be a solid buffer against black slaves, frontier Indians, and very poor whites. The growing cities generated more skilled workers, and the government cultivated the support of white mechanics by protecting them from the competition of both slaves and free Negroes. As early as 1686, the council in New York ordered that no Negro or slave be suffered to work on the bridge as a porter about any goods either imported or exported from or into this city. Spelled with two T's. In the southern towns, too, white craftsmen and tradesmen were protected from Negro competition. Imagine a black slave being better at your job than you are. They're taking our jobs. Well, maybe you suck. Anyway, in 1764, the South Carolina legislature prohibited Charleston masters from employing Negroes or other slaves as mechanics or in handicraft trades. Middle-class Americans might be invited to join a new elite by a tax against the corruption of the established rich. The New Yorker, Cadwal, I cannot say this name, Cadwallader Colden. Who the hell names their child Cadwallader? That's a first name, Cadwallader Colden. I think both parents need to be slapped. In his address to the freeholders in 1747, attacked the wealthy as tax dodgers, unconcerned with the welfare of others as he himself was wealthy, and spoke for the honesty and dependability of the middling rank of mankind, in whom citizens could be best trust our liberty and prosperity. This was to become a critically important rhetorical device for the rule of the few who would speak to the many of our liberty, our property, our country. Notice how they use this all-inclusive language, but the poor and the poorer classes had nothing to do with liberty, property, and country. They didn't own anything, but they got them to believe the myth that it's our liberty, our country, our property. You see how they use that? Similarly, in Boston, the rich James Otis could appeal to the Boston middle class by attacking the Tory Thomas Hutchinson. James Henrietta has shown that while it was the rich who ruled Boston, there was political jobs available for the moderately well off, or colors of staves, measure of coal baskets, and fence viewer, Aubrey Land found in Maryland a class of small planters who were not the beneficiary of the planting society as the rich were, but who had the distinction of being called planters and who were respectable citizens with community obligations to act as overseers of road, appraisers of estate, and similar duties. It helped the alliance to accept the middle class socially in a round of activities that included local politics, dances, horse racing, cockfights, occasionally punctuated with drinking brawls. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote in 1756, "The people of this province are generally of the middle sort, and at present pretty much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers, or men in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks he has the right to civility from the greatest. Indeed, there was a substantial middle class fitting that description. To call them the people was to omit black slaves, white servants, displaced Indians, and the term middle class concealed a fact long true about this country, that, as Richard Hofstadter said, it was a middle class society governed for the most part by its upper class. Those upper classes to rule needed to make concessions of the white middle class without damage to their own wealth or power, at the expense of slaves, Indians, and poor whites. This bought loyalty, and to bind that loyalty with something more powerful than even the material advantage, the ruling group found in the 1760s and 1770s a wonderfully useful device. That device was the language of liberty and equality, which could unite just enough whites to fight a revolution against England without ending either slavery or inequality." Chapter 4, I cannot wait to start Chapter 4 in our next reading. I want to thank you all for joining us, for joining the Skeptically Speaking show. I absolutely love this book. I love its unvarnished truth. I love its unflinching loyalty to truth, truth spoken to power. We must keep this in mind. If we're ever to have any freedom in this country, if we are to have equality, democracy in this country, we have got to unite. It is the working class that is going to make the difference in this country. The rich and powerful can only do so much. They can only do what we allow them to do. They can only do what we allow them. We work in their shops. We work in their businesses. We ship their goods. And this is why class warfare is so it is so effective. It gets us fighting amongst ourselves. And this is the same playbook they've been using for millennia. Isn't it the same? Isn't it always? With that, let's go ahead and play some exit music. Thank you so much for sticking it out and listening to my ramblings and rantings and readings. And we're going to continue this book in our next reading. So if you haven't followed me yet and you would like notifications, please become a skeptic. If you join the skeptics team, you get added to our TikTok chat. If you reside in the U.S., I can add you to the TikTok chat. Unfortunately, it's not allowing me to add all my members. I've got some members who live in Europe, in the UK, and I can't add them, and it's a bloody shame. It really is. But we'll keep trying. we'll see you on the next reading. And I got to remember to keep this mic low. It's super powerful. If it's too high, it just vibrates. Yeah, I can tell the difference in the sound quality. All right. See you all later. Thank you so much. Let's say goodnight to Kick. Let's say goodnight to YouTube.